Welcome back to Game Review. My name is Caleb Denby, and today I'm going to be taking you through another game from the Tata Steel Masters tournament that has been going on recently. This is a game between the 16-year-old Iranian Alireza Firouzja and Vladislav Artemiev from Russia. Now, Firouzja's been on a bit of a hot streak lately. He's been performing very, very well in these super tournaments, and that was no different for the start of this Tata Steel Masters. And here we see he managed to actually win this game against Artemiev, and we had this happen in a Caro-Kann. And personally, I'm devastated. Caro-Kann, one of my favorite openings, always hurts to see it get beaten, but Alireza did it very, very accurately and very professionally. It was very impressive to see. So we see e5, bishop f5, h4, h5, and then c4. And this is not the most topical line, actually. These days, after h4, h5, a lot of white players have been trying to do bishop d3, and after takes, e6, bishop g5. And this is how players with the white pieces have been playing for an advantage in this advanced variation quite often. But this was not Alireza's choice. He chose c4, trying to break in the center very early on and give black some concrete problems. Black responds with e6, supporting d5. See knight c3, knight e7, knight ge2, not coming to f3, but rather to e2. The idea of possibly harassing this bishop in the future. In the game, black plays knight d7. Obviously, in the Caro-Kann, a very common break is to play c5, but due to the way that black has played in the opening, this pawn break is actually not going to be as good here. We had to put this knight on e7 to support our c-pawn, so now, after c5, this pawn can actually be captured. This can be rather difficult for white to deal with, especially with the threat of a knight coming into this d6 square. So rather than c5, black supports his pawns from behind a little bit more with knight d7. White continues with knight g3, like I said, harassing this bishop. This bishop drops back to g6. This bishop does come out to this g5 square. We see queen b6 now is the main move, and now Alireza chooses a bit of a sideline. The most common move here by far is queen d2, simply defending this b pawn. But white chooses this move, rook c1. And here, you might think that black can simply capture this pawn on b2, and you might be correct. But white's simply going to develop very naturally with bishop d3, and after takes, your queen does start to feel a little bit out of place on this b2 square. And you're going to have to contend with an eventual rook b1, trying to regain this pawn on b7. This can be quite dangerous for black to go and start grabbing these queenside pawns while the king is still stuck in the center like this. So instead, black chose a more conservative approach. Rather than take this b2 pawn, he simply captures on c4. And now, white has given up control over this d5 square, and black will look to use that to his advantage in this game. Bishop takes c4 is white's choice. And now black really started to go astray here. And once black started making inaccuracies, Alireza really didn't take his foot off the gas, and he really punished black quite effectively. In the game, black played knight f5, which is a very understandable move. It aims to trade off pieces immediately and try and reach more of an endgame type position where having this king stuck in the center isn't going to be such a big deal. And while this is commendable, there are some concrete problems with it, which we will see. Something black might have considered instead is to play queenside castles, either immediately or after a move like queen b4, which does clear this space for the knight if need be. You can imagine queen b4, something like bishop b3, and now after queenside castles, we're putting a lot of pressure on this d pawn as well as this e pawn, kind of indirectly, using this pin against the queen. And this is pretty difficult for white to deal with, actually. And the main lines usually go kingside castles, and white actually does give up this pawn for compensation. And you can see kind of a stark difference between these types of lines and what happens in the game. Because in these lines, white's center kind of collapses, and we'll see that something very different happens in the game. So once again, would have liked to see something along the lines of queenside castles, or maybe queen b4, followed by queenside castles. Instead, though, knight f5 was black's choice, trying to trade off pieces. In response, Alireza simply castles. You can't really take this pawn on d4, because you run into problems with a very, very nasty move, knight b5. And this is something you really do hate to see. If this knight were to be captured, first of all, simply bishop takes, and white is going to regain this piece on d7, and also black is looking a little bit checkmated. The most forcing line goes a6, queen d4, knight d4, bishop d7, king d7. Now after rook d1, this piece is going to be regained. And likely these complications are something black didn't really account for. White simply ignoring the threat to the d4 pawn and continuing. I do want to briefly mention knight b5. You might be tempted to ignore this, but that fails to checkmate. So always got to be careful. So this pawn is actually uncapturable, which is really unfortunate for black here. But instead, black offers more trades of pieces, and in this case, white actually does accept, but black has given up something in order to trade off these pieces. This king is now locked in the center. Queenside castles no longer legal, kingside castles also illegal due to the king having moved, and this is going to cause black some problems. Queen d2 was played, finally keeping an eye on this pawn. Queen d8 was black's choice, perhaps not the best, but it's really difficult to find moves. He is, of course, making this threat here, and Alireza responds to this threat quite effectively with knight d1. The point being, if you want to take this now, I'll have a check to step out of this annoying pin, and then I can capture your knight. Knight b6 was black's choice, trying to make use of this d5 square. But now Alireza, once again, ignores the threat, plays the ambitious knight e3. Now, if you were to capture this, I have moves like queen b4 again, and also moves like knight takes f5 that you're going to have to contend with. King f8 is black's choice, trying to get the king to safety. But after knight f5, pawn takes e5. Once again, we'd like to take off this bishop, but in this case, there's queen b4 check, and we can save the knight before recapturing. So the bishop gets to live. We have to capture back on f5. And now the end is really near. You see the power of white's center, as well as the power of the white bishop over the black knight here. Black does pick up this pawn, but this pawn is pretty irrelevant to the game, actually. Simply rook e1 supports the center even further, and now after rook h6, white uses the center to open up the black king, and the end is near with this file opening, this diagonal opening, and this diagonal already looking at this king, and checkmate is approaching. We see pawn takes, bishop takes, this rook comes to e8, and this bishop collects this f5 pawn, because why not? We see a trade of rooks. Black tries to come back to defend his king with queen d8, but now, after queen d3, a nice move, king f7, and queen f3, white is rerouting around this black king, and there's simply no shelter anywhere on the board for this king. The queen comes to f6, once again trying to defend. Now queen b3 check, king f8, queen a3 check, queen d6, and now queen e3. And after some fancy footwork with the queen, Alireza is coming through on the e-file. Queen d8 was black's choice, simply queen e4. Alireza is in no rush to checkmate the king, because the king isn't going anywhere. Queen e4 starts making these types of threats on the king after bishop g6. Rook f6 is black's choice. He continues with bishop g6 anyways, threatening a checkmate. King d8 with the idea of rook f8 to block. But now, queen h4, queen d5, rook e8 check, rook f8. Now after queen e7, it's very apparent that the black king is not going to survive. I keep saying this, but it was never really in doubt. The king with no shelter on the board, and this knight being a useless piece, was doomed from the start. Knight d7, bishop c2 is Alireza's choice to really highlight the unfortunate placement of black's pieces. Queen takes d4 is what black tried. And now rook f8, knight f8, bishop b3, and the king can't stay tethered to the knight. And Alireza wins a piece and goes on to win this game, which we'll check out very, very quickly. Of course, this is just an extra bishop. Queen b2 was played, bishop g8 check, king h6, queen f4, g5, queen d6, king g7, bishop b3. This king, once again, very, very lacking in shelter. Queen a1 check. And black does trade the queens to avoid getting checkmated, but of course this is a hopeless endgame. Down a full piece. White collects the kingside pawns, uses the bishop to stop black's queenside, and then advances this pawn to victory. And after g6, c3, and bishop d1, black threw in the towel and resigned here. White's simply queening first. So once again, a very impressive game from Firouzja here, ripping open the center and the king using his central majority, and black playing a little bit slightly odd. It's a good reminder not to focus simply on trading pieces, but to get your pieces into the game and find counterplay. Thank you for joining me this week on Game Review, and I will see you in the next episode.